Welcome to Classic Audiobooks Library. Timeless tales of mystery, romance, and adventure. Please subscribe. And now, let's begin. The War of the Worlds. Book 1. The Coming of the Martians. Chapter 1. The Eve of the War. No one would have believed, in the last years of the 19th century, that this world was being watched keenly and closely by intelligences greater than man's and yet as mortal as his own, that as men busied themselves about their various concerns, they were scrutinized and studied, perhaps almost as narrowly as a man with a microscope might scrutinize the transient creatures that swarm and multiply in a drop of water. With infinite complacency, men went to and fro over this globe about their little affairs, serene in their assurance of their empire over matter. It is possible that the infusoria under the microscope do the same. No one gave a thought to the older worlds of space as sources of human danger, or thought of them only to dismiss the idea of life upon them as impossible or improbable. It is curious to recall some of the mental habits of those departed days. At most, terrestrial men fancied there might be other men upon Mars, perhaps inferior to themselves and ready to welcome a missionary enterprise. Yet across the gulf of space, minds that are to our minds as ours are to those of the beasts that perish, intellects vast, and cool, and unsympathetic, regarded this earth with envious eyes, and slowly and surely drew their plans against us. And early in the 20th century came the great disillusionment. The planet Mars, I scarcely need remind the listener, revolves about the Sun at a mean distance of 140 million miles, and the light and heat it receives from the Sun is barely half of that received by this world. It must be, if the nebular hypothesis has any truth, older than our world, and long before this Earth ceased to be molten, life upon its surface must have begun its course. The fact that it is scarcely 1/7 of the volume of the Earth must have accelerated its cooling to the temperature at which life could begin. It has air and water, and all that is necessary for the support of animated existence. Yet so vain is man, and so blinded by his vanity, that no writer, up to the very end of the 19th century, expressed any idea that intelligent life might have developed there far, or indeed at all, beyond its earthly level. Nor was it generally understood that since Mars is older than our Earth, with scarcely a quarter of the superficial area and remoter from the Sun, it necessarily follows that it is not only more distant from time's beginning, but nearer its end. The secular cooling that must some day overtake our planet has already gone far indeed with our neighbor. Its physical condition is still largely a mystery, but we know now that even in its equatorial region the midday temperature barely approaches that of our coldest winter. Its air is much more attenuated than ours, its oceans have shrunk until they cover but a third of its surface, and as its slow seasons change, huge snowcaps gather and melt about either pole and periodically inundate its temperate zones. That last stage of exhaustion, which to us is still incredibly remote, has become a present-day problem for the inhabitants of Mars. The immediate pressure of necessity has brightened their intellects, enlarged their powers, and hardened their hearts. And looking across space with instruments and intelligences such as we have scarcely dreamed of, they see, at its nearest distance only 35 million miles sunward of them, a morning star of hope, our own warmer planet, green with vegetation and grey with water, with a cloudy atmosphere eloquent of fertility, with glimpses through its drifting cloud wisps of broad stretches of populous country and narrow, navy-crowded seas. And we men, the creatures who inhabit this earth, must be to them at least as alien and lowly as are the monkeys and lemurs to us. The intellectual side of man already admits that life is an incessant struggle for existence, and it would seem that this too is the belief of the minds upon Mars. Their world is far gone in its cooling, and this world is still crowded with life, but crowded only with what they regard as inferior animals. To carry warfare sunward is, indeed, their only escape from the destruction that, generation after generation, creeps upon them. And before we judge of them too harshly, we must remember what ruthless and utter destruction our own species has wrought, not only upon animals, such as the vanished bison and the dodo, but upon its inferior races. The Tasmanians, in spite of their human likeness, were entirely swept out of existence in a war of extermination waged by European immigrants in the space of 50 years. Are we such apostles of mercy as to complain if the Martians warred in the same spirit? The Martians seem to have calculated their descent with amazing subtlety. Their mathematical learning is evidently far in excess of ours, and to have carried out their preparations with a well-nigh perfect unanimity. Had our instruments permitted it, we might have seen the gathering trouble far back in the 19th century. Men like Schiaparelli watched the red planet. It is odd, by the by, that for countless centuries Mars has been the star of war, but failed to interpret the fluctuating appearances of the markings they mapped so well. All that time, the Martians must have been getting ready. During the opposition of 1894, a great light was seen on the illuminated part of the disk, first at the Lick Observatory, then by Perrotin of Nice, and then by other observers. English readers heard of it first in the issue of Nature dated August 2nd. I am inclined to think that this blaze may have been the casting of the huge gun, in the vast pits sunk into their planet, from which their shots were fired at us. Peculiar markings, as yet unexplained, were seen near the site of that outbreak during the next two oppositions. The storm burst upon us 6 years ago now. As Mars approached opposition, Lavelle of Java set the wires of the astronomical exchange palpitating with the amazing intelligence of a huge outbreak of incandescent gas upon the planet. It had occurred towards midnight of the 12th, and the spectroscope, to which he had at once resorted, indicated a mass of flaming gas, chiefly hydrogen, moving with an enormous velocity towards this Earth. This jet of fire had become invisible about 12:15. He compared it to a colossal puff of flame suddenly and violently squirted out of the planet, as flaming gases rushed out of a gun. A singularly appropriate phrase it proved. Yet the next day there was nothing of this in the papers except a little note in the Daily Telegraph, and the world went in ignorance of one of the gravest dangers that ever threatened the human race. I might not have heard of the eruption at all had I not met Ogilvy, the well-known astronomer, at Ottershaw. He was immensely excited at the news, and in the excess of his feelings invited me up to take a turn with him that night in a scrutiny of the red planet. In spite of all that has happened since, I still remember that vigil very distinctly. The black and silent observatory, the shadowed lantern throwing a feeble glow upon the floor in the corner, the steady ticking of the clockwork of the telescope, the little slit in the roof, an oblong profundity with the stardust streaked across it. Ogilvy moved about, invisible but audible. Looking through the telescope, one saw a circle of deep blue and the little round planet swimming in the field. It seemed such a little thing, so bright and small and still, faintly marked with transverse stripes and slightly flattened from the perfect round. But so little it was, so silvery warm, a pin's head of light. It was as if it quivered, but really this was the telescope vibrating with the activity of the clockwork that kept the planet in view. As I watched, the planet seemed to grow larger and smaller and to advance and recede, but that was simply that my eye was tired. 40 millions of miles it was from us, more than 40 millions of miles of void. Few people realize the immensity of vacancy in which the dust of the material universe swims. Near it in the field, I remember, were 3 faint points of light, 3 telescopic stars infinitely remote, and all around it was the unfathomable darkness of empty space. You know how that blackness looks on a frosty starlight night. In a telescope it seems far profounder, and invisible to me because it was so remote and small, flying swiftly and steadily towards me across that incredible distance, drawing nearer every minute by so many thousands of miles, came the thing they were sending us, the thing that was to bring so much struggle and calamity and death to the earth. I never dreamed of it then as I watched. No one on Earth dreamed of that unerring missile. That night, too, there was another jetting out of gas from the distant planet. I saw it. A reddish flash at the edge, the slightest projection of the outline just as the chronometer struck midnight, and at that I told Ogilvy, and he took my place. The night was warm and I was thirsty, and I went stretching my legs clumsily and feeling my way in the darkness to the little table where the siphon stood, while Ogilvy exclaimed at the streamer of gas that came out towards us. That night, another invisible missile started on its way to the Earth from Mars, just a second or so under 24 hours after the first one. I remember how I sat on the table there in the blackness, with patches of green and crimson swimming before my eyes. I wished I had a light to smoke by, little suspecting the meaning of the minute gleam I had seen and all that it would presently bring me. Ogilvy watched till 1, and then gave it up, and we lit the lantern and walked over to his house. Down below in the darkness were Ottershaw and Chertsey and all their hundreds of people, sleeping in peace. He was full of speculation that night about the condition of Mars and scoffed at the vulgar idea of its having inhabitants who were signaling us. His idea was that meteorites might be falling in a heavy shower upon the planet, or that a huge volcanic explosion was in progress. He pointed out to me how unlikely it was that organic evolution had taken the same direction in the two adjacent planets. The chances against anything manlike on Mars are 1,000,000 to 1, he said. Hundreds of observers saw the flame that night and the night after, about midnight, and again the night after, and so for 10 nights, a flame each night. Why the shots ceased after the 10th, no one on Earth has attempted to explain. It may be the gases of the firing caused the Martians inconvenience. Dense clouds of smoke or dust, visible through a powerful telescope on Earth as little grey, fluctuating patches, spread through the clearness of the planet's atmosphere and obscured its more familiar features. Even the daily papers woke up to the disturbances at last, and popular notes appeared here, there, and everywhere concerning the volcanoes upon Mars. The serio-comic periodical Punch, I remember, made a happy use of it in the political cartoon. And, all unsuspected, those missiles the Martians had fired at us drew earthward, rushing now at a pace of many miles a second through the empty gulf of space, hour by hour and day by day, nearer and nearer. It seems to me now almost incredibly wonderful that, with that swift fate hanging over us, men could go about their petty concerns as they did. I remember how jubilant Markham was at securing a new photograph of the planet for the illustrated paper he edited in those days. People in these latter times scarcely realize the abundance and enterprise of our 19th century papers. For my own part, I was much occupied in learning to ride the bicycle, and busy upon a series of papers discussing the probable developments of moral ideas as civilization progressed. One night, the first missile then could scarcely have been 10 million miles away, I went for a walk with my wife. It was starlight, and I explained the signs of the zodiac to her, and pointed out Mars, a bright dot of light creeping zenithward, towards which so many telescopes were pointed. It was a warm night. Coming home, a party of excursionists from Chertsey or Isleworth passed us singing and playing music. There were lights in the upper windows of the houses as the people went to bed. From the railway station in the distance came the sound of shunting trains, ringing and rumbling, softened almost into melody by the distance. My wife pointed out to me the brightness of the red, green, and yellow signal lights hanging in a framework against the sky. It seemed so safe and tranquil. Chapter 2. The Falling Star. Then came the night of the first falling star. It was seen early in the morning, rushing over Winchester eastward, a line of flame high in the atmosphere. Hundreds must have seen it, and taken it for an ordinary falling star. Albin described it as leaving a greenish streak behind it that glowed for some seconds. Denning, our local night mail driver, saw it. He described it as a moving rapidly and unusually bright body that crossed the sky from the southwest to northeast. It seemed to him that it fell on Horsel Common, near the sand pits. His impression was confirmed by a few other observers, but the majority saw it over Woking, and only one or two guessed at the magnitude of its fall. Most believed that the missile had fallen somewhere on the common between Horsel, Ottershaw, and Woking. I was at home at that hour and writing in my study, and although my French windows faced towards Ottershaw and the blind was up, for I loved, in those days, to look up at the night sky, I saw nothing of it. Yet the strangest thing in my experience is that although I heard nothing of the common fall that night, a newspaper reporter was able to give a fairly accurate account of the occurrence the next morning. I remember how I had gone down to the village after breakfast on the morning of that first falling star, and how people gathered in the street at the news. I heard one man, it was Henderson, the landlord of the Silver Star, saying that he had seen the light in the sky, and that he had heard the sound of the impact. He was a sensible, sober man. That night, after the 11 o'clock news, I went up to the common, as did several others, to see what had happened. There were already several people out there when I arrived. A boy was going round with a lantern, shouting that the shooting star had fallen somewhere on the sand pits, and a crowd of about a dozen people had already gathered at the edge of the pit. I stood among them, holding my bicycle. One or two lanterns were swinging, and I saw the black bulk of the pit against the starlit sky. The people were speaking in low voices. The very freshness of the night seemed a part of the silence. It was a clear night, I remember, with a thin moon over the pine trees. As I stood there, I heard the voice of Ogilvy. He was explaining something, pointing towards the sand pits. He had seen the thing falling in the sky, and he had come out to look for it. "What is it?" said someone. "Something from Mars," said Ogilvy. He was obviously excited. He talked of the chances of its being a meteor, of the enormous velocity of such a body, and of the heat it must generate in tearing through the atmosphere. He described it as a cylinder, with its end buried in the ground. The metal was still glowing hot. He was certain that it had come from the planet Mars. The suspicion of a shell exploded among us. Someone suggested it might have been fired from a warship or a piece of ordnance, but Ogilvy scoffed at the idea. There was a general disbelief, a sort of faint derision, yet many lingered. It was a strange sight, with the stars shining so quietly above and the strange cylinder lying half buried in the sand. A thin smoke or steam rose from it. Ogilvy, with his lantern, examined the thing. There were deep grooves and circular markings on the metal. One or two people touched it and found it hot. Others examined the sand around it, and then we stood watching. The thing had not moved at all. Ogilvy talked of telegraphing to London and getting a specialist to come down and examine the object. And then, as the night drew on, people began to go home. I remained for some time, watching. By 2 in the morning, the common was deserted, and I returned home, still wondering over what I had seen. Chapter 3. On Horsel Common. The next morning was very wet. I had my breakfast late, and hurried out to the common in time to see the last of the people who had come overnight to see the strange object from Mars. I found a little group of them surrounding the pit. Some were examining the cylinder, some were digging with spades in the sand. Others stood watching the movements of a man who was plainly an artisan. The cylinder was now plainly visible. The outer surface was smooth and shining. It lay tilted slightly up on one side, with the top partially unscrewed, and a number of strange grooves and markings were visible upon the end that projected above the sand. I heard Ogilvy explaining that the object was made of some metal that was entirely unknown to science. He was talking to a sharp-eyed, thin-lipped man who was evidently a journalist. Ogilvy said that the markings were unlike anything he had seen before. The cylinder, he said, must have dropped from the sky like a shell. He was sure it had come from Mars. The little group of onlookers seemed perplexed by the object. One man had a field glass and was studying the grooves on the metal closely. A few were poking the sand about with sticks. I saw a man stoop down and touch the metal with his hand. He drew back quickly, exclaiming that it was still hot. The crowd was cautious now and kept back from the pit's edge. Someone brought a bar of iron and tried to pry open the cylinder further. The metal rang under the blow, but the lid did not move. Then Ogilvy and the journalist had a short conversation, and the journalist made some notes in his notebook and left hurriedly. Soon after that, a lad came running up with a message for Ogilvy. He read it and handed it to the journalist, who returned and began to question Ogilvy about it. The message said that another cylinder had been observed in flight and that it was expected to land later in the day. This news caused a buzz of excitement. Then, without warning, the top of the cylinder began to rotate. It was unmistakably turning. The crowd drew back as one man. Then the lid fell off with a loud clang, and something wriggling, appeared on the edge of the pit. Everyone recoiled, horror-stricken. There was a moment of silence. Then a sudden movement. People turned and fled. I stood paralyzed by the sight. The thing that emerged was something out of a nightmare. A round, grey mass, bulging and quivering, with tentacle-like appendages groping from its body. It was utterly unlike anything I had ever seen on Earth. It heaved itself up slowly and clumsily. The body seemed soft and moist. There was a disc-like face with a lipless mouth that quivered and gurgled, and two large, dark, oily eyes. The monster's head turned from side to side. Then more tentacles appeared. Someone shrieked. There was a sound of footsteps running. I turned and followed, stumbling in the sand, until I reached the edge of the common. I looked back once and saw the creature still writhing out of the cylinder. People were scattering in all directions. I returned home, shaken and bewildered. I told my wife what I had seen. She listened silently, then asked if I was sure. I said that I was. She wanted to leave the house at once. I tried to calm her, saying that the government would surely act quickly. But I was not certain of anything. That night, we did not sleep well. Every sound outside made us start. I kept imagining the grey thing creeping across the fields. I wondered what it wanted, what it could do. And I kept asking myself the same question: how could such creatures have come so far through space? Chapter 4. The cylinder opens. When I returned to the common, the sun was already high. A crowd had gathered, larger than before, and a cordon of policemen had been established to keep the people back from the pit. I recognized several faces in the crowd, and heard various speculations whispered around me. No one had seen anything more of the creature. The cylinder lay silent, and the metal surface had cooled. A tall, fair-haired man was talking loudly to anyone who would listen. He claimed to be an engineer and explained how the cylinder must have come through the atmosphere. He said the grooves on the side were meant to help it spin, and that the Martians must have used gunpowder or some similar explosive to fire it from their planet. Others listened, nodded, and repeated his ideas. Near the edge of the pit, Ogilvy and a few workmen stood discussing something. They had brought a barrowload of tools, and a ladder was being lowered into the excavation. I watched as one of the men descended carefully. A few moments later, he reappeared and whispered to Ogilvy. They conferred quietly, then Ogilvy climbed down himself. There was a strange silence that settled over the crowd. Then, With a sharp hiss and a clang, the top of the cylinder began to unscrew again. This time, it rose more quickly. The crowd murmured, and people stepped backward. A round opening appeared at the end of the cylinder. From within, a series of clicking and tapping sounds echoed. Then a bar-like arm slid out, moved up and down, and retreated. Something scraped along the edge, and the lip of the opening dropped forward like a trapdoor. Out of the opening, the creature I had seen the night before slowly emerged, more completely now. The thick, oily body slithered forward. Its tentacles waved in the air. The face turned, and the two large, dark eyes stared directly at the crowd. The creature hesitated, then pulled itself forward again. There was a collective gasp. The Martian halted on the cylinder's edge. A puff of steam or gas rose around it. I saw the thing's skin was wet and glistening. Its movements were sluggish, as if the air was too heavy for it. It quivered and collapsed into the sand at the base of the cylinder. Ogilvy shouted something, and the crowd pressed forward slightly. But at that moment, the Martian raised itself again. From within the cylinder came more noise, scraping and metallic clanging. A second creature appeared at the opening. Suddenly, from the pit, a hissing sound erupted, followed by a blast of heat and light. The crowd screamed. People turned and ran. I saw a flash, a brilliant beam of white fire sweeping across the ground. A tree burst into flames. Grass and shrubs curled and smoked. The air shimmered. It was the heat ray. In moments, the area around the pit was an inferno. Bodies lay motionless in the sand. The few policemen who had stood their ground were gone. I turned and fled, the skin on my neck tingling, the roar of the fire behind me. As I ran across the common, I saw people leaping into ditches, rolling in the grass to escape the burning air. Others lay still. Smoke and fire billowed upward. I did not stop until I reached the hedge at the edge of the field. I turned back and saw a cloud of black smoke rising, and behind it the glint of metal. The Martians had begun their attack. Chapter 5. The Heat Ray. After the glimpse I had had of the Martians emerging from the cylinder in which they had come to the Earth, I made a hasty return to my home. I was so excited that I found it difficult to eat lunch. My wife was greatly troubled by my account of what I had seen. I feared that something might happen in the night, but I told her that the authorities were now fully aware of the danger and would certainly act. That afternoon, though it was still dusty and hot, I went back to the common. I found Ogilvy and the group of workmen still near the pit, along with a few policemen and several other onlookers. The burning heat had passed, but the ground was blackened and smoking in patches, and a few trees smouldered. A number of people were gathered at a safe distance from the pit's edge. Others were arriving from Woking and beyond. I heard from a man in the crowd that a company of soldiers was on the way. He said they would probably surround the pit and demand the Martians' surrender. The cylinder now lay fully opened. The lid had fallen off completely, and a ramp of metal led from the pit to the surface. I could see a large, squat shape moving just inside the shadow of the opening. It was dull grey, and the air around it shimmered slightly. Then came another flash of heat. The heat ray. There was no noise, no roar, no hiss, only a blinding glare and the sudden charring of everything it touched. The ground hissed. A cart and its driver were caught in the beam. The cart exploded in flames. The driver fell without a cry. A man standing beside me was struck, and in an instant, he vanished into smoke. Panic seized the crowd. People screamed and ran. The heat ray swept in an arc. A group of men and boys tumbled over one another to get away. The grass burst into flame. Smoke rose in thick clouds. I ran. I leapt a fence and sprinted through a field. I passed a ditch and rolled into it, scraping my arms and legs. I lay there, trembling, listening to the crackle of fire and the faint humming noise that followed the heat ray. I remained hidden for what seemed a long time. When I lifted my head, the common was a desolate, smoking plain. Here and there, the remains of a cart or a figure lay blackened in the grass. The heat ray had swept the area clean. Eventually, I made my way back home. I told my wife what had happened. She was pale and silent. I urged her to pack quickly, that we might leave at once. But as we spoke, we heard hoofbeats in the lane. A group of men were coming up the road, armed with sticks and guns. I went outside and spoke with them. They had heard rumors from London that the Martians were just a curiosity, that nothing serious had happened. I told them what I had seen. One man, a butcher, laughed at me and said he would go see for himself. He never returned. Chapter 6. The Heat Ray in the Chobham Road. It is still a matter of wonder how the Martians are able to slay men so swiftly and so silently. Many observers have remarked upon the absence of any noise when the heat ray is used. The flashing beam and the blackened trail are the only signs that something dreadful has happened. There is no report, no explosion, no cry of agony. Those struck by the ray simply vanish, or fall as if asleep. That evening, as the sun was setting, the first of the organized efforts to resist the Martians took place. A company of soldiers had arrived from Aldershot and were stationed along the Chobham Road. Word had spread of the attack on the common, and crowds gathered at various points to see the strange visitors from Mars. I had gone out once more, despite my wife's pleas, unable to resist the desire to witness what was unfolding. I stood among a crowd on a small hill, overlooking the road and the distant pit. From there, I could see a line of soldiers kneeling in the roadway, rifles at the ready. Officers on horseback moved among them. Presently, there was movement at the pit. A tall structure rose slowly into view. It was a metallic tripod, enormous in size, and it moved with terrifying swiftness and precision. Its legs bent and straightened like the limbs of some great insect. The body above was a shining metal case, and from beneath it, a long flexible tube protruded. The first shot was fired by the soldiers. A puff of smoke, the crack of a rifle. Then others joined in, a volley of shots. The bullets pattered against the metal skin of the tripod and fell harmlessly to the ground. Then the heat ray answered. A line of white fire swept across the road. Soldiers dropped where they stood. A mounted officer and his horse burst into flame. The crowd on the hill scattered in terror. I threw myself flat and felt the heat pass over me. The grass hissed. Trees crackled. Smoke rolled across the field. When I rose, the tripod was advancing, striding over the road, bending its legs to avoid obstacles, sweeping its heat ray in wide arcs. Everything before it was burning. The air was thick with the smell of scorched earth and smoke. In the distance, I saw a second tripod rise from the pit. Together, the two great machines moved forward, one toward Woking, the other in the direction of Chobham. Behind them, the pit glowed red with fire, and the night sky flickered with light from the burning common. I turned and fled again, stumbling over roots and stones, running with the terrified crowd. People were shouting, calling for help, falling in their flight. I did not stop until I reached the lane near my home. That night, my wife and I decided to leave. We packed what little we could and set out at dawn, walking toward Leatherhead, hoping to escape whatever was coming. Chapter 7. How I reached home. For several days after that evening, I remained in Leatherhead, with my wife. The weather was unsettled, and I spent much of the time walking through the lanes or sitting indoors listening to the distant rumble of guns. From time to time, reports reached us, vague and contradictory, about the movements of the Martians. People said they had destroyed Woking and had advanced toward London. Others claimed the military had forced them back. No one really knew. I was anxious about my house, and about the safety of the things I had left behind. I wanted to return, but my wife was fearful. Finally, on the morning of the third day, I resolved to go alone. I promised her I would return by nightfall. I set out early and walked swiftly. The roads were still busy with carts and wagons, filled with people fleeing toward the south and west. Some carried what they could, others had lost everything. There was a strange stillness in the air, no birds sang, and even the wind seemed to move quietly. As I approached Woking, I began to see signs of destruction. Houses had been burned. Trees were blackened and broken. The road was littered with debris. A smell of smoke and something foul lingered. I passed through Maybury and saw where the heat ray had scorched the grass. There were burnt-out carts, and in the ditches, dark shapes that I dared not look at too closely. Near Horsel, I caught sight of a tripod in the distance. It was stationary, standing like a monstrous sentinel over the ruins. I hid behind a wall and waited until it moved off slowly toward the north. When I reached my house, I found the windows shattered and the garden trampled. Inside, it was much as I had left it, though a few things were missing. I gathered what I could, some food, a few clothes, and my notebook. Then, as I was about to leave, I heard a voice. It was a man, calling out weakly from the garden wall. He was dressed in a clergyman's coat, his face pale and streaked with sweat. He said he had been hiding in the woods and had come looking for shelter. I helped him inside and gave him water. He thanked me and said his name was the curate of a nearby parish. He was clearly exhausted and frightened. We decided to rest for a time before attempting to return to Leatherhead. But as the sun set, we heard the sound of a tripod's horn echoing across the fields. A deep, metallic note that sent a chill through the air. The curate trembled. I told him we would stay the night and leave at first light. That night, I sat awake, listening to the distant sounds of the Martians, strange clangs and humming noises, as if they were building something deep within the pit. Chapter 8. Friday night. When I saw my home again, it was so far from expectation that I shivered at the sight of it. I had expected destruction, ashes, wreckage, emptiness. But it stood silent and untouched, as if nothing had happened. The garden gate was even closed. I remember pushing it open slowly, half expecting to be greeted by my wife. But the house was empty, cold, still. I returned to the curate, who waited nervously beneath a hedge a few fields away. We moved cautiously through the area, seeing no Martians, but hearing strange, mechanical noises in the distance. Metal striking metal, the clanking of vast parts being shifted. By nightfall, we had moved only a short distance. We took shelter in an abandoned cottage. I made a small fire and tried to sleep, but the curate spoke constantly, rambling prayers, confused warnings, scripture and fear mixed in his voice. He spoke of judgment and fire and God's wrath. He seemed unable to rest. Later that night, we heard a distant, rhythmic sound, a thud, a pause, a thud, a pause. The ground seemed to vibrate faintly with each step. We looked through a crack in the boarded-up window and saw a reddish glow in the sky, pulsing with the beat. A tripod passed us in the darkness. It moved like a ghost, slow, majestic, its metallic body illuminated by a strange light. Beneath it, the heat ray hung idle. The machine moved without sound except for the dull impact of its feet. The curate dropped to his knees and began praying aloud. I hushed him, terrified that he would draw attention. He wept softly, his face buried in his hands. I sat in silence, watching the fire die down, thinking of my wife, of Leatherhead, of how the world had changed in just a few days. When the tripod had passed, we sat in the darkness, waiting, hoping it would not return. That was the longest night I have ever endured. Chapter 9. The fighting begins. As the dawn broke, I roused the curate. He had slept fitfully beside me on the floor of the cottage, mumbling in his sleep. We both rose stiffly and listened. The air was still. No thudding of tripod feet. No metallic sounds. Only the quiet chirp of a bird in the hedgerow nearby, a rare and beautiful sound after such silence. We decided to move eastward toward London, hoping to find clearer roads and news of the army's efforts. I had begun to hear rumours of successful resistance, of field guns brought up from Aldershot, of artillery posted along the Thames. There was hope now, scattered and uncertain, but enough to quicken our steps. As we passed through the outskirts of Woking, the signs of destruction were everywhere. Roofless houses, blackened fields, dead cattle in the ditches. The smell of burning and something worse hung low over the land. By midday, we reached a hill near Send, from which we could see a wide stretch of country. Smoke rose in columns in the direction of Weybridge, and even as we watched, a sudden flash lit the sky, followed a moment later by a muffled, distant boom. Gunfire. The curate crossed himself. "They are fighting them," he said. I nodded. Yes. The army is making a stand. We pressed on, and as we reached the edge of a wood, we heard shouting and the crack of rifle fire. A group of soldiers ran past us, muddy and breathless, retreating from something behind them. I stopped one of them and asked what had happened. "They're coming," he gasped. "Tripods, 2 of them, coming across the river. We held them off for a while, but they've got the heat ray." We hurried after the soldiers and soon reached the crest of a slope. From there, we could see the river and the bridges of Weybridge. On the far side, guns were firing. The smoke of battle drifted across the water. Then, over the rooftops, rose the unmistakable shape of a tripod. It moved with terrifying speed, striding across the ground, its heat ray cutting a path through the defenders. One of the bridge supports burst into flame. People screamed and scattered. A battery of field guns on our side opened fire. The shells burst around the Martian. It halted, staggered. A great cheer went up from the soldiers. Then a second tripod appeared, crossing the river further upstream. It raised a long, tube-like arm, and with a hiss of steam, fired its heat ray. The guns were gone in an instant, men and machines alike. We ran. The road was choked with refugees, men, women, children, carrying bundles, pushing carts, trying to escape. I lost sight of the curate in the chaos. I climbed a fence and took to the fields, heading toward the wooded hills. Behind me, the land burned. Tripods marched through smoke and flame, and the sound of their horns echoed across the countryside. Chapter 10. In the storm. That night I camped in a field on the edge of a wood. The heat was oppressive, the air thick with smoke and the distant scent of burning. I had lost the curate in the panic of the retreat and had not seen him since. My throat was dry, and I had no food left. The stars above were hidden by drifting clouds of ash, and a red glow flickered low on the horizon where Weybridge had burned. I lay under a hedge and tried to sleep, but every noise startled me. I imagined the thud of giant feet in the distance, the sweep of the heat ray, the cry of some distant victim. But the night passed quietly, broken only by the occasional rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. At dawn, a heavy storm rolled in from the west. Thunder cracked across the sky, and rain fell in torrents. I welcomed the water. It cooled my skin and cleared the air. I drank from a puddle in the field, ignoring the dirt and grit. The storm lasted hours. Trees bent and swayed, lightning forked across the sky, and thunder boomed like artillery. I moved from field to field, avoiding roads and houses. The land was desolate now, empty and silent except for the storm. I passed a broken farmhouse, its roof collapsed, walls blackened with soot. A dead horse lay in the yard, flies swarming thick around its body. By afternoon, the rain had eased, and I climbed a hill to survey the landscape. Far off to the north, I saw the silhouettes of 3 tripods moving slowly eastward. One paused and turned, as if scanning the earth below. I dropped behind the crest of the hill and lay still until it passed. I pressed on, heading toward London, though I did not know why. Some instinct drove me onward, a desire to understand, to see the end of this strange invasion. I had no destination, no plan, only a restless need to move. As night fell again, I reached a small village. The houses were empty, doors hanging open, windows shattered. I found a pantry with a few tins of food and some stale bread, enough to quiet my hunger. In the corner of the kitchen, a dog growled. It was a gaunt, trembling thing, its ribs sharp beneath its fur. I spoke to it gently and tossed it a piece of bread. It ate quickly and then followed me as I left. I slept in a barn that night, curled in the straw, the dog beside me. Outside, the wind sighed in the trees, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Chapter 11. At the window. I have already said that my storms of emotion have either passed or do not matter. My narrative, at any rate, has lost its fervor. I can see nothing but the battle that is over, the troops dead, the ruins abandoned. I am no longer moved by terror or by wonder. My curiosity, my sympathy, are now focused on what remains. After the storm had passed, I awoke stiff and sore. The dog was gone, and the barn silent. I ate what little remained of the food and resumed my journey. The roads were muddy and rutted, and the silence of the countryside was deeper than ever. At a village on a hill, I found a house with its windows intact and the front door ajar. I called out but received no answer. Inside, it was clean and orderly. I climbed the stairs and looked out from an upper window. From there, I saw the plain stretched wide beneath the grey sky. Smoke hung low in the distance. Far off, a line of black shapes moved, slow and mechanical. Tripods. I watched them for a long time. They moved without hurry, scanning the land below them. I could not tell what they searched for. Suddenly, I heard footsteps below, slow, dragging. I crept downstairs and found a man in the kitchen. It was the curate. He had survived. He was pale, gaunt, his clothes soaked and torn. He greeted me with a strange, breathless laugh and sat down at the table without speaking. I fetched him water and shared what food remained. For a long time, we sat in silence. Then he began to speak, disconnected thoughts, fragments of scripture, warnings of fire and judgment. I realized that he was near the edge of madness. We stayed in that house for 2 days. Outside, the tripods passed without drawing close. From time to time, we heard distant noises, clanking, grinding, bursts of fire. The curate spent most of his time muttering and staring out the window. I watched the road, waited for something to change. But nothing did. On the third day, the food was gone, and the curate began to panic. He cried out that we were doomed, that the end was near, that God had abandoned us. I tried to calm him, but his frenzy only grew worse. Then we heard it. A sound outside, a deep, metallic hum, rising and falling like a chant. A tripod. I pulled the curate away from the window, but he resisted. I warned him to be silent, but he shouted, screamed. And then the house trembled. Glass shattered. The floor shook. The Martians had found us. Chapter 12. What I saw of the destruction of Weybridge and Shepperton. As the dawn grew brighter, we crept from the cottage. The curate was trembling, but silent now, and we kept low behind hedgerows and ruins. The Martians had passed during the night, but their path was clear, scorched trees, crushed buildings, a trail of blackened earth. By mid-morning, we reached the Thames near Weybridge. A great crowd had gathered there, soldiers, refugees, townspeople, hoping to cross to safety. Boats were being loaded, children were crying, officers were shouting orders. And beyond the water, through the smoke, we saw the Martians. There were 4 of them now, striding across the fields. They moved like enormous machines, smooth and certain, without haste, their tripedal legs rising and falling with terrifying grace. Their long arms swung beneath them. A 5th tripod followed behind, bearing a large, canister-like device between its limbs. A battery of field guns on the far bank opened fire. Shells exploded around the leading tripod. For a moment, it staggered, smoke billowing from its side. A cheer rose from the crowd. But the 2nd tripod raised its heat ray. A blinding beam swept across the battery, and in an instant, the guns were gone. Men ran in all directions, the field a chaos of fire and screams. I pulled the curate down beside me behind a low wall. The crowd at the river panicked. Boats overturned. People fell into the water. The bridge shook as people rushed across. Then the 5th tripod reached the edge of the hill. It paused, lifted the canister high, and launched it into the air. It arced over the Thames and landed near the fleeing crowd. There was a hiss, then a billow of green smoke. The black smoke. It spread low, curling over the ground. People coughed, collapsed. The smell was sickly, metallic. I covered my face with a rag, pulled the curate to his feet, and ran. We found shelter in a boathouse, where the door had been torn off. Inside, we waited, gasping, watching the smoke drift past. Through the cracks, I saw the Martians moving slowly, steadily, without fear or pause. The field was silent now. Weybridge and Shepperton were gone. Chapter 13. How I fell in with the curate. After the destruction at Weybridge, I wandered eastward, dazed and weak, with no clear aim. The curate followed me, his manner uncertain and childlike. He no longer spoke of scripture or judgment, but clung to me with a desperate dependence. We had escaped the black smoke, but we had no food, no plan, no safe place to go. The sky was overcast, the air thick with the lingering scent of burnt wood and smoke. From time to time, we heard distant sounds, the hum of machinery, the echo of falling stone, but we saw no other living soul. We passed through villages that had been hastily abandoned. Doors stood open, windows broken. In some places, food and clothing had been left behind. We took what we could carry, bread, a flask of water, a few scraps of meat, and moved on. The curate grew more anxious each day. He muttered constantly, sometimes to himself, sometimes to me, though I could make little sense of what he said. He feared the Martians, but he feared starvation more. I tried to remain calm, to keep him moving, but it became harder with each step. At one village, we found a pump and drank deeply. A dead dog lay nearby, and the water tasted faintly of smoke, but we were too thirsty to care. We crossed through fields and woods, avoiding roads and open spaces. Once, as we crouched in a hedgerow, we saw a tripod move across the plain ahead of us. It did not stop. We waited in silence until it was gone. That night, we sheltered in a ruined church. The walls were cracked, and the roof had caved in, but we found a corner free of debris and rested there. The curate prayed quietly while I stared at the stars through the broken beams above. I began to wonder if we were the last men alive. The next day, we moved more slowly. The curate was weak and frequently sat down, refusing to move. I had to beg him to go on, to remind him that staying in one place was more dangerous. Eventually, we reached the edge of a town. I did not know its name. Fires had swept through parts of it. The streets were empty. We passed a row of shops, their fronts smashed in. We found a butcher's and took what dried meat remained. As we stepped into the street again, I heard a low, humming sound. The curate stopped and grabbed my arm. We ducked into a cellar just as a shadow passed across the road outside. A tripod. We waited in the darkness, hearts pounding. The floor trembled. Then, after long minutes, the sound faded. We had survived another encounter. But I knew our strength was failing, and I feared that soon, one of us would break. Chapter 14. In London. My younger brother was in London when the Martians fell at Woking. He was a medical student, working for an examination, and he heard nothing of the arrival until Saturday morning. The morning papers had vaguely mentioned a mysterious cylinder, but it was only with the midday edition that the news began to spread with any clarity. Then came the first panic. Even then, Londoners were slow to believe. The official statements were brief, reassuring, dismissive. There were rumors of a few deaths, accidents, it was said, and of some strange heat weapon. But these were dismissed by most as exaggerations. People went about their business. The shops were open, trains running, the theatres preparing for evening performances. But by afternoon, the truth began to strike. Refugees began to arrive from the southwest, on foot, in carts, by train. They told wild stories of monsters, of fire, of sudden death. Some were wounded, some wept openly, some wandered aimlessly through the streets. My brother went out into the streets and found the usual crowds thinner, the usual noise quieter. A subtle fear was spreading. By Sunday morning, all doubt was gone. The Martians had destroyed Weybridge. Chertsey had been abandoned. The army was in retreat. London was threatened. Still, many delayed. Some thought the danger exaggerated. Others believed the Martians would be defeated before they reached the capital. But those who had seen the refugees knew better. My brother packed a few belongings and joined the flow of people heading north and west. He walked. The trains were overcrowded, the roads choked with carts and horses. All day, people moved. The rich in carriages, the poor on foot. Children cried, dogs barked, people shouted to one another. There was no order, only motion. That evening, he reached Barnet. The streets were filled with the displaced. Every inn and stable was full. He found shelter in a barn and slept among strangers. He had heard that the Martians had reached Staines. In the morning, he joined the exodus again. The road was now a great river of humanity, all moving away from London. In that crowd, he met two women, a woman named Miss Elphinstone and her younger sister. They had been forced from their home near Tooting and were trying to reach relatives in the north. Their pony cart had broken down, and they were frightened, alone. My brother helped them repair the cart and offered to travel with them. They moved more slowly now, but with purpose, watching the skies, listening for the sound of tripods. At midday, they heard the guns again, distant, fading. Someone said that the army had made a stand near Ealing. But no one knew for sure. Chapter 15. What had happened in Surrey? It was while the curate and I were hiding in the ruined house near Sheen that I first began to learn more fully the extent of the devastation. In our time of hiding, I reflected on the destruction I had seen, and I tried to piece together what had occurred in the days since the cylinder fell at Horsel Common. The Martians, after their initial landing, had constructed machines, tripods, towering and swift, each armed with the terrible heat ray. From the first cylinder, others followed, falling with regular intervals across Surrey. Each new arrival brought more destruction. The army had done what it could. Field guns were brought up. Lines were formed. But the heat ray and the black smoke overcame all resistance. Weybridge, Chertsey, and Woking had all been laid waste. The defenders at the Thames had been annihilated. People fled from the towns. Roads were choked. Trains packed beyond capacity. By the time the government began to grasp the severity of the invasion, it was already too late. The Martians, in their machines, moved with dreadful precision. They built towers, mechanisms, strange structures whose purpose no one could guess. They worked without rest, tirelessly, with a dreadful unity of purpose. Wherever they went, they left ruin behind them. By the time I hid in that house with the curate, the Martians had already reached the outskirts of London. The great city had begun to empty, millions on the move, driven by fear. Only fragments of these events reached me in those days. The curate and I lived like animals, creeping through alleys, drinking from streams, eating whatever we could find. I remember one evening when we saw the glow of the Martians' machines lighting up the sky from behind a ridge. The curate trembled, muttering prayers. I said nothing. I began to understand that this was not a war, it was an extermination. And still, the cylinders fell, one after another, marking the slow, methodical spread of the Martian conquest. Chapter 16. The Exodus from London. So great was the influx of people into the northern suburbs of London after the Martians' appearance in Surrey that the trains were incapable of carrying the crowds that gathered at every station. The suburban roads became congested with refugees, some on foot, others with horses, carts, and bicycles. All were pushing northward. By Tuesday morning, when the Martians were at Sunbury and Upper Halliford, the whole of London north of the Thames was in a state of panic. Horses were scarcely to be bought for love or money. All the available conveyances were already in use. Men tramped northward by the thousands. The main roads were still open, but the railways, though still running, were overcrowded and chaotic. The authorities had lost control. My brother, with Miss Elphinstone and her sister, continued to travel northward. Their pony cart made slow progress along roads clogged with refugees. Every town they passed was filled with anxious people. Food was scarce. Water had to be fetched with difficulty. As they reached Edgware, a mounted policeman tried to turn them back. The authorities feared a riot in the city if people were not kept moving. But the crowd surged forward, and the three travelers pressed on. They spent that night in an orchard, sharing food with a group of strangers. In the morning, they resumed their journey, now walking beside the pony, guiding the cart through fields and around blocked roads. At Barnet, they learned that the Martians had destroyed much of St. Albans and were moving toward the north and east. Rumors flew, of flying machines, of gas attacks, of new weapons. No one knew the truth. Fear spread faster than the facts. Near Potter's Bar, the pony collapsed. Exhausted and unable to go on, it was left behind. They joined the stream of pedestrians, carrying what little they could. My brother, though weak and weary, encouraged the women onward. He had taken it upon himself to see them to safety. They moved with the crowd, a river of humanity flowing through the countryside, all with the same goal, escape. By the afternoon of that day, they reached a village where trains were still running, though under military control. With difficulty, they secured passage on a train moving northward. As the train pulled out, they saw distant flashes in the southern sky. The Martians were still advancing. Chapter 17. The Thunder Child. Had the Martians possessed the instincts and intelligence of human beings, they might have secured complete control of southern England within a week. But their minds were focused on destruction and conquest, not occupation. They did not understand our ways or anticipate our response. On Wednesday, a fleet of ships carrying refugees left the mouth of the Thames. Among them were paddle steamers, yachts, tugs, and transports. One vessel, the Thunderchild, a naval torpedo ram, was stationed to protect the fleet. My brother and his companions were aboard one of the transports. The sea was calm, but the sky was heavy with smoke and cloud. The ships moved slowly, heavily laden, while behind them, the land still burned. Suddenly, a cry rang out. Tripods had been seen approaching the coast. Panic spread among the passengers. People crowded the decks, staring toward the shore. Two tripods emerged from the haze, striding into the water, their limbs splashing as they waded forward. From one, the heat ray flashed. A yacht exploded in flame. The Thunder Child moved forward. People on the ships watched in awe as the ironclad advanced at full speed, smoke pouring from her funnels. The Martians raised their arms, aiming the heat ray. But the sea spray and movement of the ship seemed to confuse them. Then the Thunder Child fired. A shell burst on the leg of one tripod. It staggered. Another shell struck its body. The machine toppled and fell into the sea with a massive splash. A cheer erupted from the ships. The second tripod turned and began retreating. But the Thunder Child pursued it, steaming full speed into the path of the heat ray. There was a blinding flash. The Thunder Child vanished in steam and smoke. When the haze cleared, both the ship and the second tripod were gone, sunk. The fleet, unopposed, steamed safely out to sea. My brother watched in silence. A moment of hope. A sign that the Martians could be fought. That evening, from the deck of the transport, he looked back at the dark line of coast, England, in flames. End of Book 1. Book 2. The Earth Under the Martians. Chapter 1. Underfoot. My story resumes about 10 days after the flight of the Thunder Child. During that time, I had been hiding with the curate in a small cottage near Halliford. We had lived like animals, surviving on scraps, afraid to move during the day, listening for the sounds of the tripods. It was on the 11th day that the curate's behavior began to change. He grew restless, muttering more frequently, pacing in circles. He would often speak of sin, of judgment, of divine punishment. He had become a haunted man, and I feared for both of us. That morning, the sky was overcast. The air hung heavy with silence. No birds sang. No machines moved. We ventured cautiously from our hiding place in search of food. The streets were empty. The houses deserted. We found a half-looted grocer's and took what remained, some tins of food and a few dry biscuits. We carried them back to the cottage and bolted the door behind us. In the afternoon, we heard a distant, muffled thud. Then another. We froze. The curate pressed his face to the window. "They are coming," he whispered. I pulled him back and urged silence. The sound drew closer, a rhythmic pulsing, like the beat of a giant drum. The ground began to tremble. Then, just beyond the trees, a tripod appeared. It moved slowly, almost idly, scanning the earth with its camera-like head. Beneath it, one of its long arms dangled, ending in a claw. Its metal body gleamed faintly in the grey light. We crouched in the darkness and watched. The machine paused. A long, snake-like tube descended from its chassis and touched the ground. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the tripod emitted a low, mechanical sound and moved on, disappearing into the haze. We waited long after it had passed before we dared to speak again. That night, I could not sleep. The curate talked constantly, his voice rising and falling with fear. I tried to calm him, but it was clear, he was no longer the man I had met. I began to wonder how long we could survive. Chapter 2. What we saw from the ruined house. It was on the 6th day of our imprisonment that I peered through a chink in the broken wall of our hiding place and saw the Martians feeding. The sight chilled me more than the heat ray or the black smoke ever had. After the tripod passed near us, it had evidently stopped nearby. A great metallic crashing had shaken the ground. Now, as I looked out, I saw one of the machines standing motionless not 100 yards from the house. A second machine arrived and took up its place beside the first. Between them lay a strange apparatus, flat, with a framework of metallic arms and levers, and a long tube that curved upward like an elephant's trunk. I watched as a Martian emerged from the body of one of the tripods. It slid down along a flexible, metallic ladder and moved with awkward, almost sickening slowness. The creature was large, about the size of a bear, with tentacles writhing from its round body. Its eyes glistened, and it made no sound as it approached the machine. The second Martian followed. Together, they placed something dark and limp, onto the table-like platform. Then I understood. It was a human body. The machine vibrated. One of the arms moved. I turned away. The curate, sitting beside me, was whispering prayers. I did not silence him. I could not move. We stayed like that for hours, listening, watching, dreading what would come next. The Martians returned to their tripods and stood motionless. The feeding machine continued its dreadful work. That night, I could not sleep. The horror of what I had seen filled my thoughts. The curate was silent now, withdrawn. I feared he had seen too much, or perhaps too little to understand. The next day brought no relief. The Martians remained nearby, and we dared not move. I began to ration our food. Water was running low. Once, I heard a voice calling in the distance, a human voice. It was answered by a hiss and then silence. No more voices came after that. Time passed slowly. Day and night became a blur of shadow and fear. The house we hid in was falling to pieces. The walls cracked. The floor sagged. But we stayed there, clinging to the hope that something, anything, would change. The Martians were feeding. And we were the next course. Chapter 3. The Days of Imprisonment. The arrival of a second fighting machine drove us from the open scullery we had occupied into the darkness of the cellar beneath. There, we sat in the black silence, scarcely daring to breathe. I had no idea how long we remained there. Time had ceased to matter. The curate, once always talking, now sat trembling and silent. He had grown thin, his cheeks hollow, his eyes wild. He muttered to himself, sometimes praying, sometimes laughing softly, sometimes cursing. He was losing himself to terror. Our food was gone by the third day. I had rationed it carefully, but there had never been much. We had no water but what we could catch from the drip in a broken pipe overhead. Outside, the Martians moved from time to time. We heard their machines, the whir of servo mechanisms, the soft hiss of the heat ray at work far off. Sometimes they passed so close we could hear the metallic creaking of their limbs. Once, the wall above us collapsed with a sudden crash, sending dust into our hiding place and nearly burying us. For 2 days, we lay under that dust. The curate cried out once, but otherwise, we lay still, barely daring to speak. When the sounds passed, I scraped away the debris and pulled him free. He stared at me with vacant eyes. Later, we heard new sounds, grinding, hammering, the dragging of metal. I peered through a crack in the rubble and saw something new. A mechanical device, smaller than the tripods, with crab-like limbs and jointed arms. It was collecting debris, stones, beams, furniture, and carrying it away. The Martians were clearing the ruins. We stayed hidden. The curate became worse, feverish, delirious. He talked of sacrifice, of judgment, of sin. I could barely understand him, and I began to fear that his madness would betray us both. I slept fitfully, always half alert. Hunger gnawed at me. My limbs grew weak. The air in the cellar was foul. On the 5th night, I awoke to find the curate standing over me, his eyes wild, holding a piece of broken wood like a club. He whispered, "They are calling me." I stood slowly, carefully. He raised the wood and cried out. Outside, I heard a stirring. I struck him. He fell. The noise had betrayed us. Chapter 4. The Death of the Curate. I struck the curate and then stood over him, breathing hard. Outside the ruined house, I heard movement, slow, deliberate scraping sounds, like metal on stone. I turned toward the broken wall and crouched low, listening. The curate lay moaning at my feet. The noise outside grew louder. I thought I heard a mechanical hum, a familiar rhythm that set my nerves on edge. I covered the curate's mouth with my hand. He struggled weakly, then lay still. The scraping came nearer. I feared the Martians had heard us. Then, suddenly, silence. I waited. Minutes passed. Still nothing. I removed my hand. The curate did not stir. He was dead. The blow I had struck, meant only to silence, had killed him. I sat in the darkness, staring at his body. Horror and grief filled me, but there was no time for mourning. I pulled his corpse into the shadowed corner and covered it with rubble. Then I crept to the narrow slit in the wall and peered out. A tentacle was reaching into the debris. It moved slowly, groping, searching. I froze. The tentacle withdrew. Later, the mechanical crab returned. I watched it pick through the wreckage with eerie precision, collecting metal, wood, even books. It worked without sound or hesitation, like some monstrous insect performing a task it did not understand. For 2 more days, I remained hidden beside the dead curate. Hunger tormented me. My lips were cracked, my tongue swollen. The stench of the cellar was unbearable. At last, the crab came no more. I saw only silence and sunlight beyond the broken wall. I decided to risk it. Cautiously, I crawled from the rubble and out into the ruins of the house. The Martians were gone. And I was alone. Chapter 5. The Stillness. After I had emerged from the ruined house, I stood motionless for a long time, weak from hunger and silence. The sun was high in the sky, and the ruins around me lay quiet and lifeless. There was no sign of the Martians, no trace of their machines. The world had become a vast, empty grave. I climbed to the top of the rubble and looked out over the countryside. Here and there, smoke curled lazily from heaps of ruins. Trees were scorched. The road was a scar of blackened dust. There was no sound, no birds, no voices, no movement. The stillness was more terrible than noise. I walked, my limbs stiff, my stomach aching. I passed the place where the curate had died but did not stop. My thoughts were dull, mechanical. I simply moved. After a mile or so, I came upon a dead dog, its ribs showing through the fur. I turned away. Even if I had wanted to eat, I could not. I followed a lane that once had been green and shaded. Now the trees were broken and blackened, the hedges burned. I passed a farm, its roof collapsed, its animals gone or lying still in the fields. I drank from a ditch and nearly choked on the bitterness of it. All day I wandered, sometimes walking, sometimes resting. Once, I thought I saw a figure in the distance and called out, but it was only a scarecrow still standing in a field. Toward evening, I reached a small village. The houses were empty. Doors stood open. I searched for food but found only dust and silence. I took shelter in a house with a broken roof and slept on a bed of clothes gathered from a wardrobe. That night, I dreamed of the curate and the Martians, and of vast machines walking through cities of ash. When I woke, the silence remained. It seemed as if I had outlived the world. Chapter 6. The work of 15 days. For 15 days, I wandered through a world of ruin and silence. At first, I moved in fear, expecting every ruined house or shadowed hill to conceal a Martian. But gradually, I realized that they were gone. The tripods no longer strode across the fields. The heat ray no longer burned. Even the mechanical crabs had disappeared. The world had been conquered, and left behind. I walked through towns where the dead lay in the streets. Shops stood open, their goods untouched. Fires had burned themselves out. The stench of decay hung in the air. Once, I came upon a group of bodies lying beside a collapsed cart. They had died trying to flee, trampled, perhaps, or struck by the black smoke. I passed them without stopping. At another village, I found a man sitting on the steps of a church. He stared at me but said nothing. His clothes were torn, his eyes hollow. I spoke to him, but he did not reply. I left him there, unmoving, a statue of grief. Everywhere I went, the story was the same: destruction, silence, loss. But the Martians had not remained. I began to wonder, why? At last, near Harrow, I saw something new, the red weed. It had spread in every direction, growing along roads and across fields, choking rivers and covering buildings. The Martians had brought it with them, and it had flourished. But now, it was dying. In the streams, it turned brown and rotted. On dry land, it shriveled. The air was thick with its stench. I realized then that the Martians had not understood Earth. They had brought life from Mars, but it could not last. They themselves had vanished, and their red weed with them. At night, I slept wherever I could, in barns, cellars, even under hedges. My dreams were haunted, but I no longer feared the tripods. My fear had burned out, replaced by weariness. Then, on the 15th day, I saw London. Or what was left of it. The great city was a blackened skeleton. Smoke rose in lazy spirals. Bridges were broken. Buildings had collapsed. Streets were filled with ash and silence. I walked into the heart of it, alone in a dead metropolis. Chapter 7. The Man on Putney Hill. As I came into Putney, I saw a man standing on a hill beside a broken fence. He was watching the horizon with a kind of fierce intensity, as if expecting something. I called out to him. He turned slowly, then beckoned me to come up. He was dressed in a soldier's uniform, torn and dusty, but he held himself with purpose. His eyes were bright, and he spoke with energy. "You're alive," he said. "Good. I thought I was the only one left." We sat on the hill together and talked. He had been an artilleryman, part of the force destroyed near Weybridge. After the collapse, he had gone to ground, hiding by day and foraging by night. He had survived by cunning and luck. He spoke of the Martians with contempt. "They're intelligent, yes," he said. "But not invincible. They didn't count on germs." "Germs?" I asked. "Yes. Bacteria. Our blood is full of them, and the Martians don't have immunity. They never face disease on Mars. That's why they've died." I stared at him, uncertain. "You mean, the Martians are gone?" "Dying," he said. "Some dead already. I saw one tripod collapse, just fell over. No heat ray, no smoke. It just died." We sat in silence. Around us, the world was quiet, ruined but peaceful. Then he spoke again, with sudden fire in his voice. "We must rebuild," he said. "Hide underground, make tunnels, survive. Wait. Then strike. Take back the Earth." He described his plan, an army of survivors, living like rats in the saws, waiting for the right moment. The strong will rule. No more weakness, no more softness. We'll come up and take what's ours. I listened but said nothing. There was something in his voice that disturbed me. Not madness, but something close, an obsession. That night, I slept in the cellar of a ruined house while he kept watch. In the morning, he was gone. He had taken what little food I had. Chapter 8. Dead London. After the artilleryman left, I wandered through the ruins of London. It was a city of silence. I walked along empty streets, past the skeletons of great buildings. The roads were choked with ash and debris. Windows were shattered, doors open or hanging loose. The only movement came from the wind blowing scraps of paper and soot through the air. There were no people, no voices, no sound of life. In places, I found bodies, curled in doorways, lying in gutters. They were dry, withered, as if death had claimed them long ago. Some clutched bundles of belongings. Others simply stared upward, eyes blank. I saw no birds, no animals. Not even the red weed remained. It had rotted into slime. The rivers were black and still, choked with debris. In a church near Westminster, I sat for a long time in the nave, staring at the shattered roof and the broken glass. A statue of an angel lay on its side, its face cracked. There was no hope in the city, only stillness. Then, as I walked near Regent's Park, I heard a faint sound, a low, gasping note. I froze. It came again, a wet, coughing breath. I moved toward it, past the ruins of a hotel, into a narrow lane. There, slumped beside a fallen tripod, lay a Martian. It was dying. Its skin was grey and blistered. It moved feebly, struggling to breathe in our air. Around it, other Martians lay, motionless, twisted, dead. They had succumbed not to bullets, but to bacteria. The smallest creatures on Earth, germs, had destroyed them. They had come with their vast intellects and machines of war, and they had been undone by the simplest forms of life. I watched the last Martian twitch once, then fall still. And I knew, then, that the war was over. Chapter 9. Wreckage. I stood for a long time beside the dead Martians, watching as the wind stirred their lifeless limbs. Around them lay the wreckage of their machines, broken tripods, shattered arms, torn tubes. Their mighty war engines had become monuments of failure. I walked on through London, dazed. The silence remained, but now I felt it less as a threat and more as a presence. The city had been wounded but not destroyed. Its soul endured. As I passed through the ruins, I noticed changes. People were beginning to emerge, cautiously, quietly. From cellars, from alleys, from the countryside, they came back. Dirty, thin, silent, but alive. We spoke little. There was no need. A nod, a glance, was enough. We had all seen too much. In the days that followed, I helped where I could. We buried the dead, cleared streets, gathered what food remained. The railways were gone, but carts and horses returned. Fires were lit again. Wells were drawn from. The heart of humanity had survived. I heard later how the Martians had fallen across the world, not by human hand, but by the hand of nature. In Paris, in Berlin, in New York, the same story. They had died. We learned that their blood had no resistance to Earth's smallest organisms. The germs we carry unnoticed had overwhelmed them. They had never faced infection on Mars, and their systems had no defenses. Their machines, though strong, had no immunity. The irony was immense. Man, who had faced extinction, had been saved not by his weapons or wisdom, but by the most humble forms of life. As London stirred to life again, I felt the world turning back toward light. The fear passed. The silence lifted. Still, even now, I cannot look at the stars as I once did. I remember what they brought. Chapter 10. Epilogue. And now, as I write this in my study, safe and well once more, I find it almost impossible to believe that all that has happened is more than a dream. The storm has passed, and London is rebuilding. The streets are full again. The trains run. The world has resumed its motion. But I, who have seen the Martians walk, who have hidden from the heat ray, who have seen men crushed like insects, I cannot forget. There are nights when I still wake suddenly, thinking I hear the metallic thud of a tripod. Sometimes I wander outside and look up at the stars, wondering what might yet come. I know now that we are not alone in the universe. We were not the first intelligence to rise, and we may not be the last. The Martians may have been destroyed, but others may follow. There may be greater threats waiting beyond sight. Yet for now, Earth is ours again. I think of the poor curate, of the artilleryman, of my brother and the women he helped, of the thousands who died. And I think of the strange way salvation came, not from guns or government, but from the tiniest creatures of Earth. Perhaps we are not so mighty, after all. But perhaps we are not so weak either. The future is unknown. But I walk it now with open eyes, with a heart that has survived terror and silence and ruin. And I live. This concludes the end of the story. Thank you for listening to Classic Audiobooks Library. To hear more free stories like this, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We hope you'll join us again for more timeless stories and original works. Until next time.